Welcome to Gratz Park. This is one of the oldest northern developments in the city of Lexington. So this is where we're going to be finding a lot of our earliest examples of Lexington architecture. What did you all read about? Did you read? Yeah, you read? Okay, tell me what you read about. If I took up some of your free time so that you could read, what was it that you read about? Anybody? Yes.
Like Georgian and federal style stuff.
Georgian and federal style. So what was the era that you read out of? What was the time period?
Late 18th century, early 19th.
Late 18th century, early 19th century. What was the book calling it? Colonial. It's probably a little bit problematic when we term anything colonial architecture, especially when we're talking about any of these buildings, because it happened after the American Revolution, but it is a term that is often used. We're not going to be really finding a lot of Georgian architecture as far west as Kentucky. Why might that be? What's that? It came later. So what do you think we're going to be finding? What comes after Georgian architecture? Federal architecture. Do we have any good examples of federal architecture that you can see around here? The Hunt Morgan House. Can everybody point to the Hunt Morgan House? All right, let's talk about the Hunt Morgan House. What can you tell me about this house by looking at it? What are the character-defining elements that you think make this building a good example of federal architecture? Exactly. It's an extreme case of symmetry. So when we look at it and we divide it in half, where do we see the symmetry on the exterior? The door. That's the first thing that I see. What do you notice about the door? There are two of them. Okay. What else?
Fan lights.
The fan light window.
Side lights.
It's got side lights. What are side lights? What's a fan light and what are side lights for those of you that don't know?
Fan lights on the top, side lights are the one next to the door.
So the fan light is the semicircular window that is over the door, and the side lights are on either side of them. What do you notice about the materials that are being used in the fan light window and the side lights? What is that made out of? You think it's plexiglass?
Leaded glass.
Leaded glass. Why is it leaded glass? It has what are called cames. You guys want to know what a came is? A came is that lead or metal piece that is in between the glass. It's actually shaped like an eye. If you were to take the pieces of glass and slide them in, it would be as if you were to take an eye, a capital I, and you were to rotate it so that each piece of glass fits in the concave pieces of the eye. So this is a little bit unusual. What are the other windows made out of? What's that? Wood. Those are called double hung windows. Those are a lot more popular. They are very, very common in Georgian and federal architecture. What else is symmetrical on this building? The chimneys. I'm actually not even sure if both of those chimneys are working chimneys. I believe that one of them was put in place just so that it will achieve symmetry and balance to the building. Again, remember that we're talking about an era where the focus of architecture is math, symmetry, balance, reason. This is the architecture of the Age of Enlightenment. I want you to look at the brick bond. Do you guys know what a brick bond is? What's a brick bond? Those of you who are studying the building arts, what's a brick bond? It's the pattern that the bricks are laid in. Do you guys know the difference between a header and a stretcher? Do you want to go over there and look and see? What's that? You're going to have to speak up really loud.
One brick goes like this, and the other one is that.
Okay, so which one is which? Okay, so the stretcher is the long piece. The header is the piece that appears to be short because it's actually tying several widths of brick together. This is how you can tell if a building is brick facade or if it is a solid brick building. This building is early enough that it is a solid brick building. It's also notable historically. So at the beginning of the preservation movement in Lexington, if you look across the street, what do you see? You go diagonal from where you're standing, what do you see? If you look way back there, you see a church. I mean right there on the corner. Parking lot. So that's where the Colonel Thomas Hunt House was located. It was constructed in the 1790s. It was demolished in the 1950s. So a concerned group of Lexington citizens banded together to save this house, the Hopemont, the Hunt Morgan house, from the wrecking ball, and that group later became the Bluegrass Trust for Historic Preservation. So when you look at the sign, you see that it has that BGT. Remember, we talked about local nonprofit groups that advocate for historic preservation. This is ours in Lexington. So this is where they really started, by restoring this house. They turned it into a house museum. You can actually take tours of it. Many of you have probably been inside. So that's a little bit of history about this house. Let's kind of scoot on over and look at some other historic houses. Another old house. It's an old house. Would you say that it's a historic house?
Probably.
Does it look the same to you as the Hunt Morgan house? Yes. Who raised it? Who said yes? I thought I heard somebody say yes. Some of you said no. Raise your hand if you said no. How is it different? Why isn't it the same? It looks like an old brick house to me.
It's not symmetrical.
It's not symmetrical. Tell me why it's not symmetrical. Let's break this down.
The left side, there's columns in the front spot.
Okay.
On the right.
Okay. So it has a porch with columns on one side and it's absent from the other side.
There's a tower. Oh, sorry, Dan. Sorry. How to take one aside and not like one on the other side.
Okay, so it has an octagonal side, a tower. We're gonna wait for him to go past. Alright, so it has an octagonal tower on one side that's absent from the other. What else? Yeah.
The windows are not divided like that.
They have a different division and panes than the others, so they are double hung windows, and it has historic windows, right? And they're lead, or they're wood, right? But they're not the same. They have a different design to them. Okay. What do you think is different? What do you notice that's a little bit different about the decoration, the ornament that is being used on this one?
Much more elaborate.
What was the word? It looks fancier. Okay. What else? Yeah.
It's got the little lion statues up there.
It's got some lion statues out front. I'm not sure if those are original to the house, but or they can be removed, but they are typical. Yeah.
It's much more elaborate with the arches.
It's a lot more elaborate. It has a lot, the ornament is much more obvious. So when we were looking at the Hunt Morgan house, and if you want to look over there from here, you can even see it. You can see that a lot of the ornament is in its symmetry. It's in its form, right? We were talking about form. Now, not all buildings have as much style, but they all have form. Something else that I noticed when I'm looking at the Hunt Morgan house, we were talking about the fan lights and the side lights, is that any ornament that is in that building is based off of geometry, right? Where a lot of these later buildings, this would be a late 19th century building, oftentimes have ornament that is organic. So you can see things like leaves, flowers, animals in the ornament of the building. Any questions about this one?
Like just like laid better, I guess. Better craft to it. Is that with time period and like material use, or just craftsmanship?
I don't know that I'd say that it was laid better. It's definitely in a different bond. it's built out of bricks that are harder, and that might be what you're seeing. The later the brick, oftentimes the better the technology for firing the brick. So the newer the building, oftentimes the harder the brick. In very, very early buildings, you have very soft brick. That's because they weren't able to get a kiln hot enough. We can talk about that. This is a perfect opportunity to talk about that. That's kind of a conservation moment. When you have a softer brick because of an older building, it's very important that you also make sure that all of your mortar that you put in between the bricks is also soft, because buildings settle over time. So if you have a very old building with soft brick and it has very hard mortar, oftentimes it's the brick that will end up cracking whenever the building settles, as opposed to the mortar, which can easily just be replaced. So in buildings you have primary and secondary materials. The brick or stone in a building is oftentimes the primary material. The glue that holds it together, which would be the mortar, is the secondary material. That is something that can always be replaced. You know, it's about the form of this building. Symmetrical. Where do you see the symmetry? I see it in the windows. I agree. What else? The chimneys. The stairs in the front. The door. Let's see. Do we have another one on this side? Yeah. Okay. If you had to name a style for this building, what style would you give it? Federal. Why?
More minimalist than a lot of the other styles.
There's more minimalism? Okay.
It's more just windows and door rather than a bunch of ornamentation.
Okay. Do you think that that is the trademark of federal style architecture? Do you think that you can have a simple building that doesn't have ornament and it would be federal? Okay. So what are some things about this building that make it federal? Because I do see ornament. It might not be as ornate as the Italianate building that we just looked at, but I do see ornament here. Yeah. Okay. So that follows a lot of the same patterns that we saw in the Hunt Morgan house. What else? Yeah. Okay. Do you think that this building is influenced from classical architecture or Gothic architecture? Classical. Classical, why? You say what?
Elegant.
Okay, so it's more elegant looking. Do you see any classical features specifically on this building? Yeah. These are called pilasters. So basically a pilaster is just a column that has been cut in two and it's been put up against the building. So you only really have a half of a column. So that's very good, yes. It has the pilasters that mimic classical columns, right? Do you think that the ornament on this building is mathematic? Do you think that it resembles geometry, or do you think it's organic? It resembles something from nature? Do you see flowers or shapes? Shapes. What about the brick bond? What do you notice about the brick bond here? We're talking about construction and materials. The brick bond. It has the stretchers and headers. So this is called a, does anybody want to guess what this brick bond is called? This is called a Flemish bond. Flemish bond buildings are usually, in the United States, especially in Kentucky, buildings that were constructed in the late 18th century, well, throughout the 18th century and into the early 19th century, but we usually find them in the late 18th century in Kentucky and early 19th century. What about this green roof? What do you think this green roof is? Copper. Why do you say that? And it gets a patina. Kind of like the Statue of Liberty. We all think of the Statue of Liberty as this big green lady, but she is actually copper, right? It's the same with this. Okay. Well, you can see here, actually, let's point out this. Whenever we look at the foundation, what do you think that the foundation of this building is? Anybody? Limestone foundation. Why might we build foundations in Kentucky out of limestone? We have a surplus of it, it makes sense. A lot of places, a lot of coastal cities, especially in the South, do not have easy access to brick. The problem with that is that bricks are very porous and they oftentimes act like a sponge, so it will carry water oftentimes from the ground to the roof and it can rot an entire building. We're lucky, here we have limestone, which works well with water, so we can use it on foundations. And then just above that, you have a course, which is the layer. The course is the layer of headers, which is followed by a course of stretchers. Actually, it looks like two courses of stretchers, and then it goes into header, stretcher, and then another course of stretcher, header, header. And it just repeats as it goes on. Very, very solid brick wall. So earlier we were talking about the quality of the bond next door. A Flemish bond is actually one of the better quality bonds. However, it's very expensive because it takes a lot of brick. Sometimes you only see a Flemish bond in the front of a building. Eventually, as buildings get old, later, newer, you see less and less of it, like what's across the street. Here? All right, so I would argue, we were talking about simplicity earlier. I would argue that this building is very simple, wouldn't you? What style do you think this building is? What's that? Folk. Do you think it's federal? We talked about how federal buildings are simple. Why is it not federal? It's from the time period, right? It's from the late 18th century. Why might it not be federal?
It's not the same style or material.
I would argue that this building doesn't even really have a style. I wouldn't say that this building was a styled building. I would say that this is more of a vernacular building. And whenever you're looking at more of a vernacular building, we're focusing on what?
Function.
What's that?
Function.
Function. What do all buildings have? Form. Remember, all buildings have form, not all buildings have what?
Style.
Style. Okay. So what do you notice about the form of this building?
Pretty much just a square.
It's pretty much just a square, kind of like a small cube. Okay. What do you notice about the building and construction of this building? Building materials, etc. Yeah. Okay, so it's got stone on the bottom. What else? Wood, specifically what type of wood? Do you think this is like the wood that you might buy today? No? What do you notice about it? What's another word for it? Raw? Raw? Timber? I might use the word log. Right? What's a word that's oftentimes used for a building like this? Cabin. Log cabin. Evan, tell me, why is log cabin not the appropriate use for all buildings that are log?
They're not all cabins.
They're not all cabins. Why?
Well, I mean, if you just look at this, call this a cabin.
Right. So why is this one maybe a cabin and others are not?
Why, I mean, I would call that a house,
Okay.
not a cabin.
All right. So think about like these big. Think about those big lake houses that, or like, yeah, oftentimes they're lake houses and they're made out of logs. People will say, we're gonna go to my family's cabin for the weekend. And the thing has like a big loft. It has a living room that's all glass on the back with several layers of porches. The thing is like 5 bedrooms. It's got a big kitchen with granite countertops in it. It's got like a dining room, a living room, like maybe a game room in it. Is that thing a cabin? No, it's just a log house, right? So usually you would call it log and then whatever the utility of the building is. So if it was a store, it would be a log store, right? In this case, it would be a log house. It's only a cabin because, what is a cabin?
One room, small facility.
Right, it's just one room. That's the thing that makes a cabin. So you can have a brick cabin. There's a good chance that when this was built across the street, I don't know, I've never been inside, that it was a brick cabin, right? You can have a frame cabin, you can have a stone cabin. This one just happens to be log. What are some things that you notice about the condition of this building? Okay, so it looks like it's got shingles on it. So you think that it might have had shingles before. Do you think that that's a good or a bad thing? You think it's bad? How many of you guys think it's bad to take a log building and cover it up with shingles? Shingles or siding? How many of you all think that it's a bad or a good thing to cover it up with shingles or siding? I'm actually going to make a statement on this that might be a little bit shocking. Oftentimes it can be a bad thing to leave a log building exposed to the elements. So a lot of, we're going to wait until this truck goes, I'm going to lose my voice. Oftentimes in Kentucky, log buildings were covered with shingles or different types of siding. Several different types of cladding were used. This was done just like any other building to protect the structure of the building. Whenever that is removed, the structure is exposed. So you guys are welcome to come and like touch or feel this or look at it. But something that you might notice is that the logs have deteriorated to some extent. Go ahead and like touch it or look at it up close. Come. Unless you'd rather talk about this under fluorescent lighting in a concrete building. What do you see? What do you notice? What's going on with the logs? It's got a lot of weathering. It's got chipping. What's up? It's got maybe some bug holes that are in it, some insect holes. Some of them might be beetles, termites, ants. Could be lots of things. It's got cement that's being used as the chinking, which is probably too hard. That is what's keeping a lot of them together. It's got, so historically it probably would have had something softer. I noticed a lot of you guys went like this when you got done touching it, or you went like this. What's that about? Why did you do that? Dust. What do you think it was? I don't think it was dust. What's that? I don't think it was pollen either. I think it's little pieces of log that are coming off in your fingers. Why might that be problematic? When you've got a very simple building like this, your primary building material is what? On this building, we talked about primary and secondary materials. What's your primary material? Log. What happens if log is no longer existing on this log building? No building. No log, no building, right? What happens if the chinking happens to flake away? It could fall apart, but if it did, you could probably put it back together and put new in, right? But once the log is gone, your building's gone. So oftentimes it's best to go ahead and leave any kind of siding that you've got, something that will protect it. That is the point of siding. That is its utility. Oftentimes I've seen where somebody will have siding on a building, and then they might just cut out a small piece so that you can see that it is log. And I think that that's a nice thing to do. Any questions about this one? All right, let's trek back over. Really quick point about looking at material and construction. Oftentimes before we look at style, you look at this building, it has the door surround, it looks very Greek Revival. The top of the building looks very Italianate, but you can see that it's built with a what bond? A Flemish bond, which indicates that the building could be a lot older than the style would suggest. So it's just like today when you're on HGTV and they have some 1970s or 80s house and they update it to look new, there are still going to be telltale signs that it could have been built earlier. right, what do you notice about 228?
Has a different brick style in the front.
That's a different brick style on the front than what?
Like the side of it.
Than on the side? Why might that be? The brick could be more expensive on the front. Why would you put the most expensive brick on the front? It's the side that everybody's going to see. What's that?
They could have torn down the rest of the house and just left the facade.
Okay, they could have torn down the rest of the house and left the facade and built something new behind it. That's a possibility. We'd have to do research to be able to find out if that's the case. We could look at Sanborn maps and different documents to see how the building had changed over time. What else do you notice about it? It's got fan lights and side lights. What style do you think this building is? Say it loud, say it proud. You think it's a federal building? How many of you guys think it's a federal building? How many of you guys don't think it's a federal building? We're gonna wait for the lawnmower to go. What makes you think that it's not a federal building? Okay. So it's not symmetrical. How many people have noticed it's not symmetrical? It's kind of unusual, isn't it? It kind of has this look like maybe the federal building across the street does. But it's almost as if it's been cut in half. Why might you only have a half of a federal building? That's confusing, isn't it? What's that? Well, the road could get in your way. What else might get in your way? Somebody name your dream car. What's your dream car?
G-Wagon.
All right. Do you have one?
No, it's not.
Why?
It's expensive.
Because it's expensive. So why might you only build a half of a federal style house?
It's expensive.
Because it's expensive. What happens if you build a half of a federal style house and you get the money later on? You build the other half and then you've got a symmetrical house, right? So that's kind of the key whenever you're looking at a lot of these. In Lexington, you see quite a few of these. So they're almost aspirational, right? It's almost as if I can build half of this, and then later on down the road, maybe I can afford to build the other half. And I've seen that done quite a bit. How might you be able to tell if that's been done? What's that?
The brick pattern, you probably see a line down the middle.
The brick pattern. There's usually a really small line, and you can very clearly see where the old or the original half house is and where it's been added onto to make it symmetrical. You can oftentimes see it in the interior too. Sometimes the woodwork will change or even the floor level will change. Any question about these? All right. So what do you notice about them? What do you notice about the form? It's similar to the last one. Do you think that what do you think that the styles of these buildings are? They could be federal. I would actually argue that the door surround on this one has kind of what looks like a Greek revival look to it. Have you guys noticed that the Greek revivals and the federals are hard to tell apart? This is something that takes years and years and years of training, and eventually your eye will start to see the difference. So I would argue that this door surround on the pink house resembles something that is more Greek revival, which is a romantic style, which is later, than this door surround on the blue house, which resembles something that is more federal. Why would this be more federal? Why would this be more federal? Say it loud, say it proud. Fan light. But very similar, right? Very, very similar. I will not ask you to decipher between the two on a test. But it does take time, it does take training to be able to recognize the differences. This is an example of a very early house, probably had a lot of federal details to it that had been remodeled. I mean, we're all very accustomed to refurbishing and remodeling. They've always done that. If something goes out of fashion, it's often very common to bring it into fashion. So this one has been remodeled so that it resembles a Greek revival. So whenever you look at the columns, you can see that they're very thick, they're boxy, more stout, kind of what we were talking about with the Greek revival. Whenever you look, you can see that there are architectural ghosts. What's an architectural ghost? Does anybody know? Yeah. Right, it's almost like a scar. It's something that was once there. So when you look above, you can see that it has the arch or possibly a fan light, or even what's that called above?
Palladian window.
A Palladian window, right. So it's a building that is, all of these things are historic. Would you want to scrape off all of the Greek revival details to get back to what we might guess would be the federal details? What do you guys think? You say yes? Anybody say no? You say no? Why might you not want to do that? The Greek revival is also historic, so all of these features are all like antique features. And if we're going to look at it, I would argue that the Greek revival features have been present on this building much longer than the federal details, and we also don't necessarily know what the federal details are. We know that this is here, so we would be removing historic features for a guess. You see why that might be problematic? We'll talk about all of these things later in the semester when we talk about this idea of paint versus scrape and the theories that go along with restoration. One more that I just want to show you and we'll conclude. Across the street, you can see this late 18th century federal building. Very, very simple, almost reminiscent of Georgian architecture. You can see that it's a little bit different. It actually has a brick water table on the base. You can tell that it is early, not only by its form, not only by its style, but also by its construction techniques and materials. When you look across this neighborhood, beforehand, how many of you just saw a lot of old buildings? Raise your hands. Can you now tell some differences now that we're starting in here? Can you tell the differences between classically inspired buildings and Gothic inspired buildings? Good, that's exactly what I wanted out of you guys. So next week we will be meeting at the Loudon House, which is the Lexington Art League. There might be an opportunity for some of you guys, if you want to go inside, to walk inside. They're doing an art installation, but it's a fabulous example of Gothic revival architecture, and I'm really excited to share it with you. I'm sorry, it's on Thursday, next class. All right. Make sure that while we were walking around that you were able to get all of the things that you might need for the scavenger hunt. A lot of it can be found in these buildings here. Go ahead and read ahead and start collecting for the scavenger hunt so that it all can be turned in this weekend.